is if you do what I do, you do have that information. People have it individually, and the group has it as a group, collectively. And then you can go into the future and say, okay, next year when we did this conference, what of these things did we actually implement? And maybe we decided some of them we couldn't do, or we didn't want to do, or whatever. And we're transparent about that. So we come back and say, and that's how you build community. That's how you build community, by having people being involved in the event in a way that they can change what happens individually.
So, okay. And I actually just want to clarify. I feel like everybody on here probably already knows this, but for people who are listening later, or maybe people who are not as familiar with the industry or with working with conferences and events. So can you just sort of explain and describe the reason why it's so important to build this community? I mean, it's not a given that if you create this conference and you put a lot of money into marketing and making some fantastic looking conference, or put a lot into your marketing ahead of time, that's made a successful conference. And what we're talking about here is actually making it something of value for people, not just to get them there, but the whole, like all the way through, and to bring them back, right?
Right. I mean, the way I think about, this is association chat, and the way I think, and I do most of my work with associations. This is, doing, a business events or special events to very different environments. But in the association world, I see associations as sort of incarnations of communities of practice. You have a group of people who are doing the same thing. 2 weeks ago, I did a conference for folks who own independent garden centers all over the United States. That's what they have in common. They're separate individual businesses, but the one thing they have in common is they run garden centers that aren't, parts of big chains, and they have a lot in common. They're not really competitors, and that's, a very typical kind of association. I just want to get back to, I may have missed answering your last question, but I don't think I answered the question about the bias of short-term evaluations, of the sort of survey money that you get. So there are a number of biases that occur. Joan points out, first of all, a lot of people don't even answer those things. There's a blog post which maybe we can post, which I wrote about how I typically get about 70% response rates to evaluations, and there are ways of making that happen during the event. But to go back to short-term evaluations, the problem with short-term evaluations, when someone gives you a sheet of paper that you fill out the moment that someone has finished speaking, or there's an online poll that you have to fill out within a few days, is that what you're really measuring is people's emotional response to the session.
Yeah. Okay. Wait a second. Stop. Okay. So hold on to that. Anyone who's listening right now, hold on to that. So we're all the time, especially on Association Chat, talking about technology, and we're looking at the apps and inside the event apps, how we can use and get the on the moment responses from people, even as presenters, even as speakers. How often we're asked to, and don't forget, to prod the audience, to prod the participants, to prod the people who are in the room with you to supply their answer. And you're saying, okay, we're still stuck in the reptilian brain. We're like getting an emotional response of what's happening there, right?
For example, I'm not a dynamic motivational speaker. No one's ever going to pay me $100,000 to inspire folks. And there are people who are great at that. They're wonderful. And there are some people who have some great messages and so on. I'm not putting down motivational speakers and so on. But the reality is that you can, if you have someone who's really good at that, you can put them on for an hour, maybe at the end of your event, and you give them that survey. Give everyone that survey at the end of that time, and and I've been the same way, all of us, you're in tears, you've been laughing, you've been taken on this emotional journey, and you say, this was an amazing presentation, this was great. And then, and I've had this experience. I remember going to a conference and seeing one of those and tweeting out, that was the best session I ever, experienced in my life. And then 3 months later, someone asked me about it, and I couldn't even remember what it was about. And had it changed my life at all?
Oh, no, don't you hate it when something like that happens? I had the experience. I was in a room and I was like, oh, this person should have been, I tweeted this out, Adrian, this person should have been the keynote. And somebody's like, yeah, right. We're tweeting in the moment. It's amazing. And halfway through, he just drops the ball, and the rest of the time he's awful. And I'm like, oh, forevermore. This tweet exists where I'm like, he should have been the keynote.
Right.
Terrible.
Right. And then there are other biases. There are other biases, for example, when we ask folks to evaluate and, give reasons why they felt a certain way, they're going to concentrate on things that they can easily talk about. For example, have you ever noticed, for example, anyone who's ever done an evaluation for a meeting has noticed that people tell you forever about the venue and the food and, anything logistical that's easy to describe. The room was too cold and so on and so forth. But again, long-term effects, I have been to meetings that have changed my life in retrospect. A year later, I realized I really was influenced by what happened at that meeting. At the time, I had no idea. If you had given me an evaluation, the next day or during the next week and said, I would have said, I would have still been struggling with that. It's like, that was my response to that was, I was really kind of shaken up by that, but I didn't really understand its impact. And a year later, it's like, oh, I'm different now. I'm doing my work differently now. I was really influenced by that. But it's very rare that happens, that you notice, you figure that out, you get that aha revelation at the time. I experienced the really important stuff. Is stuff that takes time.
Okay, so I'm gonna shoot this back at you. Now you have the moment later where you're processing and you realize, this was a fantastic experience and I learned so much. How do we? Is it that we're just not having those experiences, or is it that we just are not processing them properly? We're not going back. I think part of what your article was about, part of what your post was about, was providing those triggers as a meeting planner or as an organizer, then being able to reach out later and remind people and ask them and continue to engage. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's abnormal. I mean, this is how people work. The reality, our psychology is that we don't necessarily realize that something has changed in our life.
Right.
That's important. Our conscious brain doesn't understand it at the time. It takes time to process it. But I want to mention one thing I want to mention, because there are not a lot of tools available for doing this long-term evaluation. And I want to make sure that we, cover at least a couple of ideas that are very practical things that you can do to actually discover what the long-term value of a meeting has been. And one of them is in a post I wrote called The Reminder. It's on my blog. It's a variant of something that some of you have done. I know I've done it at events called a letter to myself that you do at the end of the event. And the organizers takes about 30 minutes. They hand out a piece of paper and an envelope, and you write down something to yourself about what you've learned, what you want to do differently, and so forth as a result of the event. And then you stick it in the envelope and address it, and then 6 months later or whatever, the attendees send it, the organizers send it to you. And it's a very simple but cool idea, and gives you some feedback, long-term feedback about, wow, this was something, and it gives you a little jolt. Oh, I did that. No, I'd forgotten all about that, and so on. So it helps to reinforce learning in the long term. So that's a really nice technique, and I think it works quite well in terms of, and it's one of the ways that you can kind of continue the experience of an event into the future. My variant of that is to add to that a feedback form, which you include with the letter, which basically says to people, we'd love you, while you're reading this letter, to also look at, to let us know whether there has been some long-term value and if so, tell us about it. Did it happen? Which session did it happen in? What was it? It could be something very specific. I'm now doing X in a different way. I met, 2 people who I now really have become part of my professional network and have really helped me in a lot of ways, and so on. And again, the blog post has full details of how to do that. And I think that's a very effective way for the conference organizers to get really valuable feedback, which could also then be used for marketing, future events and so forth as well as providing, great information on who was really provided long-term value at the event or what process or session did. The other thing you can do, which I think is even easy, well, I don't know if it's even easier, but it's certainly something that anyone could do with any kind of event, and that is to take a sample of attendees in some way and then have some interviewing, 3 months, 6 months, later, and send them a predetermined, send them an email and say, and maybe with a set of questions, and just say, we'd really like to have 15 minutes of your time and to talk to us about what your experience of this event was, and to be frank about it. We're not going to identify you and so forth. And I think anyone who receives something like that, it's such a novel idea. No one ever does it. Hardly anyone ever does it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is there anyone who's actually doing it? Because it sounds like such a good idea, but I couldn't tell you one example.
I didn't invent the idea, but no one's ever done it to me. I think it has been done, but it tends to be done at really, really fancy high-level events. But on the other hand, when you think about all the money that is spent on an event, to budget, to have someone call 20, 30 people and say, what stuck with you here? Mm-hmm. What has changed as a result? And again, I think you could justify it in terms of marketing, and you could say to someone, would you let us use your name, because that was a really amazing thing that you just told us? And they might say yes, and then you could say, so and so told us after the last year's event this. And use that as marketing for next year's event.
I just think it's incredible that there is, when you think about the money that goes into putting, especially with conferences, these huge multi-day conferences on, and that we put so much effort and energy into making sure that we give the early bird deadline, and we know how it goes, the way that the marketing looks, the way that, and even from my perspective, where I get involved, retargeting, your social media ads, all of this stuff that goes into getting people there, getting the butts in the seats. But then what? And the funny thing is, or not funny, it's actually not funny at all, is that you have these meetings, and let's say that they've invested in the experience as well. Okay, so you have great experiences, but are you learning from it? And are you then really able to grow when all you're getting is either that immediate feedback that's based on, temperature and food quality or something like that, or feeling and emotion, or, are you reaching out and continuing to see, okay, long-term, what is sticking with people? What actually held value for them? They're probably not thinking about the pot stickers anymore. They're probably thinking about what, the relationship that I got from there, or the most meaningful thing that happened from that meeting. I would think that's where that stuff comes out. And it's fascinating.
Well, Joan, I think, again, I'm just looking at the comments, and Joan has a really great comment. She says, another idea is a chart that people get at the start. What I learned, how I'll use it, the impact, and then it becomes the basis for a report. And I think that's a fantastic idea. If you've got a link to that, Joan, put it up in the chat. The way I look at that is you're framing the event, and I try to do this at all my meetings right from the start. You frame the event as a place where individual learning is happening, that you're expecting it to happen, that you need that people to get the most value out of it. You need to be conscious about that. We're going to support that, and so on. And Joan's chart is a framing device for that. Mm-hmm. So you get people thinking right at the start, okay, this is a learning opportunity for me. This is a connection opportunity for me. And if I'm aware of that right from the start, and the format is, and the processes that people are using support that, that's going to be really great. Then you're right. It gets you out of the sort of what I sometimes call the conference trance, where you're just kind of sitting there, passive, listening to someone.
I know. We fight through that. And even when we have that sort of situation, now it's built in where when they're looking for speakers, that they're like, and we encourage interaction or engagement. How are you engaging? And it's sad, because even though that intent is there to keep from us having this experience where we're watching from the back of the room and bored to tears, yet we still are just like sort of offering up, I think, superficial answers to that many times.
And it doesn't have to be like that. Someone asked me, I think I commented on a post recently about, someone had written a post about cell phone use at events and whether we should, I think it was on, maybe on the Event Manager blog, Julius's blog. about, maybe